graduate school, and then had a few different jobs, from Anaconda Minerals to working in Sacramento for an engineering firm, and then ARCO as well, so his oil and gas experience, and then California Geological Survey in 1988. So he's been there for since 1988. and he's head of the Seismic Hazards Program there, and you'll hear a lot more about that. And this is one of the more important things that the survey does. So I think we're very fortunate to have him here. We want to ask him lots of questions, speak with him afterwards about opportunities. We actually have somebody who graduated undergrad from here, Ellie Spangler, graduated in I think 2009-ish. She now works for California Geological Survey in the Seismic Hazards Program. So again, very fortunate to have Tim here. And with that, I'll introduce Tim McCrink.
And Cheryl Hayhurst.
We can do a little
Anyway, we have several Chico alum.
Okay, excellent. So you want this?
They represent you guys well.
I don't believe it.
It's the end of the day. My voice is given out. I'm a quiet talker anyway, so if you can't hear me, just speak up. I won't be offended about that. The other thing is, I'm trying to cover a very broad program at a level that's enough where you learn something about it, but also not so much that it takes all night to get through it. So I'm all for free-form questions. If I'm not answering something that you're interested in, raise your hand and stop me, and we'll go into more detail at that point as well. So, scroll now. Just a little bit about the California Geological Survey. It's been around since the 1850s. Josiah Whitney was the first state geologist in 1860. He made it to 1873, and the stories are legend about how he battled with the legislature for funding and all that kind of stuff. But as we're configured now, we're much smaller than the USGS, but we're older than the USGS. So one of the USGS folks has described it as, they're the big brother, we're the older brother. So they dwarf us in comparison, but as far as state surveys go, we're quite a bit larger than I think most of the other state surveys. The CGS is part of the Department of Conservation. Our sister divisions there are Oil and Gas, Land Resources Protection, and the Office of Mine Reclamation. They are now officially a division. And all of us are under the California Natural Resources Agency, which includes DWR, CAL FIRE, and some other big departments. So within CGS, we've got 5 major programs. And talk about them a little bit. We have the Forest and Watershed Geology. Those folks are mostly concerned with and work with timber harvesting to make sure that the timber harvest is done in such a way that the roads don't trigger landslides, which get into the streams and damage the salmon fisheries. The one that's labeled Earthquake Engineering is better known for its acronym SMIP, Strong Motion Instrumentation Program. It's one of the largest seismic networks in the world that is run there. They also run the California Integrated Seismic Network, CISN. That is the source to go to if you're looking for strong motion records for any kind of structural design or geotechnical design. That's the repository to go get strong motion records. Geologic mapping, kind of the backbone. It's kind of reverse logic, but all the maps that I'll be talking about, all the maps that are used in other programs, really go back to start with a geologic map. That's the foundation of all the work that we do when we make these derivative products. But they always suffer from funding. So somehow we need to get more funding to get more geologic mappers out there to get that going. And then, one of the oldest things that we work with is mineral resources, and I think John Klinkenbeer came up here last year and gave a presentation as well. So I run the Seismic Hazards Program. We have all or parts of about 30 people. It seems like a big number. It's bigger than a lot of state surveys in total. But what we do in our hospital and school review program, which I'll talk about, is borrow time from other programs' people so that they can review the geologic and seismologic reports that come in for hospitals and schools. So we have 5 major areas of things that we do. One of the biggest is the hazard zoning part. These are regulatory zone maps, and I'll talk more about those as we go. And what I'll do is describe what we do, the things that we're involved in these areas, how we do them in kind of brief terms, and then I'll finish up with, well, what's new and exciting in those areas that are things to be looking for in terms of technology and advancing the science. Get the direction out. As far as why we do what we do, California has a lot of earthquakes and a lot of faults. Alaska has us beat for that, but we have the population. We've got LA, we've got San Francisco, we've got large population centers sitting on top of these highly active faults. So our risk is significantly higher just because of the population there. So a study that FEMA performed, and I'll get the direction figured out here eventually, they found that the annualized loss for the entire US, 3/4 of it's in California. So we are really sitting on a powder keg of danger. When I was asked to get a little picture to put on the flyer, I pulled up our fault activity map, and I said, wow, Chico's really safe. I'm not going to get any attention from these guys. They don't care. But if you go to the beach, you might get swept up by a tsunami, or you'd be visiting somebody in LA and be in an earthquake. So it's good stuff to know.
Portable dam, too.
Yeah. We haven't induced any earthquakes recently. Maybe that's next. There. Okay, so I'll start with the earthquake shaking assessment. Dr. Ree Chen is kind of our chief senior seismologist. She spent some time here teaching engineering classes, and her husband, Bill Murray, was a geochemist in this department here. They're both living in Davis, but Ree has done a lot of work for us. She works closely with the USGS on this National Seismic Hazard Map. I think this weekend or early next week she's going to Vienna to be part of a probabilistic fault rupture hazard workshop for the IAEA. So anyway, she's top of her field, very good at this stuff. So the types of things that she works on are fault rupture probabilities. That's one of the new up-and-coming sciences. Seismic hazard analysis, probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, or PSHA, is something that is the standard for the ground motion that goes into the building code so that structures are designed to handle the expected earthquakes. And that is part of the National Seismic Hazard Map. We also do special projects for local seismic hazards. A few years back, we worked with the USGS to come up with shaking potential maps that could be understood by the average person in the San Francisco Bay Area. So related probabilistic shaking to what the source earthquake would be for that, and then turn that into a map that was attached to a table so somebody could say, hey, I want to buy this house here. This is the shaking I can expect. Will this house be able to withstand that shaking? And what is the nearest fault that's going to be the most likely source for that? So it's very useful for the average person, which is what the Association of Bay Area Governments was looking for when they asked for that map. We also look at historic seismicity. Maybe later I can help you guys browse the CGS website and take a look at, there's a ground motion interpolation tool where you can click on the map or type in a lat long and it'll give you ground shaking parameters. There's also a historic seismicity map where you click on a dot that represents the epicenter of a historic earthquake, and then you can look at all the recordings that were culled from newspapers from that earthquake. Very, very interesting tools. We also participate in the California Earthquake Prediction Council. Every time there's a big earthquake in California, this group gets together, no matter what time of day or night. They all get on the phone and they say, okay, we've had this magnitude earthquake in this area. What does that mean in terms of the probabilities of another earthquake being triggered by that one on an adjacent fault or the same fault extending to a larger distance? And then that information goes to the California Office of Emergency Services so that then they can alert local jurisdictions that, hey, there's such and such a probability that a magnitude such a size could happen as a result of this one that already occurred. We know aftershocks occur after every earthquake, and they can be as big or bigger than the one that just happened. So these people put their heads together and try to figure that out. And again, the probabilistic fault displacement hazard. So one of the things that our geologists get involved with is trying to figure out the characteristics of earthquake sources around the state. They have been doing this since the 70s or 80s, actually. In the 80s, they did it for small regions around the state. This last version of this uniform rupture forecast for California came out just a couple years ago. And what they did was they modeled every fault that they knew had the potential for rupture as a three-dimensional segmented fault trace. So you can see all the dipping faults in there. Each little tile has certain parameters about its slip rate, how often it can occur, what the characteristic magnitude will be. All those parameters are put into this 3D model. And then what they do is they crunch it through a supercomputer, and it takes days to run, and they come up with something on the order of 275,000 possible earthquakes that could happen with the whole range of probabilities. So this is the understanding of the source model that goes into all those shaking maps that we have. So that represents the source. You understand how that earthquake energy travels through the earth, right? It's losing energy as it goes. So in order to model that part of the earthquake shaking, they have ground motion prediction equations. There's half a dozen of them out there, and they all represent best estimates of how much energy will get to a particular site. And then once that energy gets to a site, you have to consider what happens to that energy as it goes through a deep basin or the top of a hill or all these other site-specific conditions that could occur. So all those things go into coming up with the shaking map for California, which then goes into the National Seismic Hazard Map, which is a picture right here. One of the other tools that comes out of our better understanding of the shaking hazards is with some simple inventories of different structure types in different areas, we can estimate what a certain magnitude earthquake will cost when they happen. So this happens down to the resolution of a census tract. Here it's shown at the county level, but this is kind of the granular picture of that other one that I showed that represents a 75% national annualized loss. Well, this is that loss subdivided by county. Very useful tool for planning. And it was maps like this that caused San Francisco and Los Angeles to rethink how they deal with vulnerable structures, unreinforced masonries, these poorly reinforced concrete structures with soft stories. So they know now that with those types of structures, they're looking at very severe losses that will take them decades to rebuild from. So if they can retrofit them now, on the basis of this knowledge, well, then they're doing a very good service. So very useful maps for the planning community. So here's some new things that are going on here. We've heard a lot about induced seismicity. Well stimulation is a euphemism for fracking. There's also acidation and other types of things that they do to stimulate wells, but mostly it's the fracking that seems to generate the most interest. CO2 sequestration, we're working with the Lawrence Berkeley Lab folks who did an assessment of if they capture CO2 and they pump it in the ground, you know, what does that do? Does it trigger earthquakes? Their trial project a few years back actually got shut down because they could not tell Solano County what the probability of them triggering an earthquake was. So they just wanted to do it and see what happened, and that wasn't going to work for the county. Geothermal development, if you look at the USGS live feed earthquakes on Google Earth, very, very nice tool, you'll see that there's a perpetual cluster of microseismicity around the geysers. And the reason you see all that is because they put all sorts of instruments, so suddenly you can see them. But they're monitoring that because they're pumping cold water in, it's fracturing the rock, and then that hot water's coming up, and they're using it to create energy. And wastewater injection doesn't seem to be a problem in California, is a big problem in Kansas and Oklahoma and states in the Midwest. Then, you know, any kind of probabilistic analysis of any of the hazards that we deal with is really critical to what we're doing. You know, not too long ago, all of these hazards were analyzed deterministically. Somebody would judge, maybe arbitrarily, and say, this is the source of my hazard. You know, I'm going to look at this fault this far away because that's the biggest, baddest one I can think of. Whereas a probabilistic approach is, I'm going to look at that source and this source and this source and all these other areas, and I'm going to aggregate all those sources, treat them all as distinct deterministic ones, and then look at which one contributes most to the hazard at my site. So it's a more robust way to look at it. It's also a better way to handle what you don't know. So you can quantify your uncertainty in every step of the way. So it's a much better way to go than to do a deterministic method. So I'm going to jump from the shaking hazard assessment into the ground failure hazard. So this is our zoning programs here. So the bar chart on the right is a graph. I'm actually forgetting where that came from. I think it was a FEMA study, but they looked at damage in terms of dollars for areas that had ground failure. Didn't say what kind, whether it was fault or liquefaction, whatever kind of damage. But if the ground was deformed, they were able to show that, hey, you know, you've got significantly more damage there. So this is one area where the building codes do kind of fall short, right? The building code is going to specify shaking levels, horizontal forces that you have to design into a structure, but they don't really address the ground failure side of it. So in California, we're fortunate enough to have devastating earthquakes on a regular basis. So what that does is it triggers the legislature to get off their duffs and actually pass some legislation. And that's happened throughout. And you'll see examples as we go through these different hazards in our different programs to see how these earthquakes have really upped the game for us, and we do a much better job, I think.
So it was the San Fernando 71 earthquake, and then the Loma Prieta 89?
That's right. I talked to Jim Slauson, former state geologist, consultant in Southern California for many, many years, back in the early 90s, right when we got the Seismic Hazard Mapping Program going. And he told me, since he was a state geologist in '71 when the Alquist Priolo program kicked off, he said, yeah, we tried to get liquefaction and landslides in at that time, but the real estate agencies, they knocked that one out. So there's always somebody who's not happy with what you're doing. So here's just a couple examples. AP, Earthquake Fault Zoning Act, 1972, following the 1971 San Fernando or Silmar earthquake. Seismic Hazard Mapping Act of 1990, followed 1989, Loma Prieta earthquake. Just a little bit of little understanding of the hierarchy of how this zoning process works. This is for AP and seismic hazard zoning. Seismic hazard zoning was kind of built on the same model as AP. We felt it was successful. So we have the State Mining and Geology Board. That's our oversight advisory group. When something significant comes up and we have technical questions, they will form a special committee of experts to come and help us resolve those problems. And that information comes into CGS in the terms of regulations and advice on how we should go about our business. We, under the state geologist, we delineate the hazard. We approve waivers. It's kind of a technicality, doesn't get used very much. And provide advisory services to local jurisdictions. Cities and counties are our primary customer for all of these things. They're the ones that actually have to implement the zones that we provide to them. So they use these zone maps to update the safety elements to their general plans. They require that a developer hire a consultant to do a site-specific investigation if they want to develop within that zone. They review the proposed mitigations, if any are proposed, to be acceptable to them. So they will issue the permit by approving that project. And they are the ones that apply for a waiver for certain areas. The property owners and the developers and their consultants are the ones that determine if the hazard is present. We map at 1 to 24,000 scale for all these hazards. We're not claiming to be perfect. We're identifying broad areas where we think that the hazard could exist, and that triggers the site-specific investigation. So if they go in there and drill some boreholes and show that there's no liquefaction, or dig a trench and say the fault's not there, we're fine with that. That's proof that they're not going to build on that hazard. So that works for us as well. And then the big thing, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, there's a real estate transfer disclosure side to all our seismic hazard zones. So if you were to buy a house tomorrow and that house happened to be in a liquefaction hazard zone, and this is a flaw in the system, after you've put your earnest money up, and when you go in to sign all the final papers, they'll stick this thing under your nose saying, hey, you're in a liquefaction zone. We've tried to get that part of it fixed through the legislature, and we're still working on it. But the real estate disclosure side of it is something that throws people off a little bit. The intent of the zones is to prevent development from building on a hazard without mitigating it. The consequence is for houses that are in those zones, they have to disclose it when they sell that house. A little bit of a technicality. The arrows going up represents that cities and counties are supposed to give us all the geotechnical and geological information that are generated from these studies. And I estimate we're probably getting 15 to 20% of those. So we need to work on that part of it as well. Here's just an example of a recent zone map that we put out. I don't know if you've seen the old style, but we, over the last few years, we went out of our way to combine landslide, liquefaction, and fault rupture hazard zones, all in a nice, easy to read format. The ones that we just put out last week on our information warehouse are downloadable GeoPDFs. So if you get a free toolbar from Terrago, you can read lat longs off that map. You can tag the polygon and hit the little information button, and the attributes in that zone will pop up, along with links back to our website and the zone report that was used to generate those zones. So they enhance the building codes because it's a ground failure topic that is not handled by the building codes. They are bimodal zones by design. The idea here is that somebody at a permit counter, a non-geoscientist, who has to evaluate whether somebody has to do something, can just say, state says you're in a zone, you have to do a certain level of geotechnical investigation. Or if you're outside the zone, you know, they might have their own requirements for that investigation, but it's not required by the state. So, you know, they look simplistic, and we went with eye-pleasing colors. We didn't want any alarming reds or oranges or anything like that. So, but anyway, it was purposely built that way for our primary customer. It's mandatory compliance, right? They have to do that geologic study. And then finally, it's the disclosure aspect again. So subdividing the hazards, the Alquist-Priolo Earthquake Fault Zoning Act of 1972, after the Silmar earthquake, most of the people in the field were observing situations like this house. They didn't have tagging. I don't know if you guys have seen after an earthquake they go out and they put red, yellow, or green tags on houses now. In '71 they didn't have that process. But what they were finding was houses that we would call red tags now, which means you don't go in them, they tear them down with the contents in them. They're total trash. 30% of the houses that were along a fault trace had red tags. Whereas the next street over, only 5 of them, well, 5% had that same level of damage. And that was just from the shaking. So it was pretty clear to everybody that something had to be done and something could be done. So they put together the Alquist-Priolo Fault Zoning Act. Now here's another example from China. We had the Chinese Earthquake Administration come and visit us a couple years ago. And Dr. Jiewei let me borrow this slide. So you can see the ramp of the fault rupture here in the Sichuan earthquake. Happened right here, pretty big uplift, and everything within 100 meters had severe damage. So building on a fault is currently not allowed in California, and it's this kind of situation that drives that thought process. I want to talk a little bit about the tools that we're using for evaluating fault hazards. And there's a lot of them. This program's been around for 40 years. The whole science of paleoseismology has kind of come up to speed in that time frame. Classic stuff, whoops. Review existing literature, what kind of studies have been done in the area, aerial photographs, stereo paired air photos. That's critical for geomorphic interpretation. LiDAR in the last decade and a half has really gotten to be the tool of choice, and I'll show you examples why. Google Earth is just incredible for that third dimensional view and being able to rotate it. Everybody's using that, especially now that it's free. Interferometric synthetic aperture radar, INSAR for short, is one. I'll show some examples in the emergency response side. Very useful tool. Various types of multispectral imagery. We've been doing LiDAR, multispectral imagery fusing, so you get the color bands of the one imagery with the high resolution of the LiDAR, and when you combine that, things really pop out well. Field reconnaissance, of course, age dating techniques, background seismicity. These are all very good tools that help us create the AP zones. But the key one, and I know a lot of you here are working on these, you can't use any of these unless you have some of these. So here's just a good example of geomorphic features that people look for. This is a piece of the San Andreas Fault. So you've got offset drainages, beheaded drainages, uphill facing scarps, all sorts of these things that to the untrained eye would mean nothing. But once you get used to looking for these things, they become critical for helping identify the fault. So this is the San Andreas Fault. You would hope that everybody would spot this. A lot of times we're looking at things that are a lot more subtle, or they've been graded or developed on, so you don't get to see them. So you have to really tune your eye to look for the very subtle geomorphic features that might still be there. Yeah, what's your question?
Why are uphill facing scarps more important than downhill facing scarps, or why do you?
It represents a sense of motion that's a little bit different than what gravity would drive.
Oh,
so more of a tectonic force than a gravity-driven force. here's that same stretch of the fault, just showing, you know, the accumulation of surface rupture over time. So in the last 13,000 years, you've had 43 events, you know, and that's a pretty good distance. Whereas in 1857, this section of the fault ruptured 10 meters. 10 meters is a lot of offset for an earthquake. You know, this is the magnitude 8+, and you know, in comparison, that's not much, but you start stacking these up over thousands of years, and you really get a lot of offset. Air photo interpretation. In a lot of parts of Los Angeles, San Francisco Bay region, there were developments on the hillsides and on the flats long before people put cameras in the air. So the earlier the photos you can get, the more precious they are for this type of work. Stereo paired, of course, is what we go by. Sometimes you have oblique photos like the one on the left. If that's all you have, there are some new photogrammetric tricks where you can actually turn these into stereo models, but you really need to know what you're doing. LiDAR, here's a little piece of the West Tahoe Dollar Point Fault. For reference, this is Highway 50 going down into Myers. This is Echo Lake up above this little glacial pond. So in 2005, we had stereo paired air photos. People were drawing the fault out here. In 2010, some of our geologists got involved in designing the LiDAR flight. So, you know, the resolution, how many dots per square meter, some of the other parameters that went into that, they helped design it. And the result was the image on the right, and here's a different view of it. And they were quite surprised that, wow, the fault's not where we thought it was. Once they were able to strip off the vegetation and take a look at the bare earth from the LiDAR DEM, they were able to do a better job of locating the fault. So in terms of geologic skills, I think everybody here saw this one, but the guys with the trained eyes were able to spot some of these other subsidiary faults in there as well. And the result was our AP zone, first ones for this part of the Lake Tahoe Basin. So here's where we've done AP zoning around the state. Some of these numbers are out of date. We have since put some out since 2012. But this 556 is right. I updated that number. So that's a lot of mapping. So what's new for fault rupture hazards? The probabilistic fault displacement hazard analysis. And I bring that up again. This is something that's really been kind of new. We can't build across the trace of an active fault in California. That's the law. There are exemptions and people do it here and there. But for the most part, people don't put structures on active faults. Makes sense. But when you have a highway or a pipeline utility or something that has to go across that, it's not a structure for human occupancy, you have to get that thing across there. They use these probabilistic methods to assess different strands of the fault, determine which one has moved the most in past history, and then determine which is the one that's most likely to move in the future, and then how much is it going to move, all with understanding the uncertainty associated with each of those decisions along the way. A good example of this is the Hetchy pipeline across the Hayward Fault. You know, I think it was $1 billion project. You know, they had to get that right. So they were able to design a pipeline with angles and sleeves and things to handle, I think it was 6 or 8 meters of offset across the most significant strand of the Hayward Fault. Very, very interesting study and good approach to do it. I think if we ever get to the point where we can build structures across the traces of fault, we'll have to know a lot of geoscience about those fault traces before we feel confident in doing that. The other thing, photogrammetry is the engineering or science of dealing with parallax, overlapping air photos. I hope you've all had a chance to use air photos for geologic work. they've come up with a new way to do that now, and they call it structure from motion. And I asked a photogrammetrist friend of mine, I said, where'd they get that term? And she said, at some point, somebody, and this is pre-Google days, somebody put a camera on a van, and they drove it down the street, and they just kept taking pictures with enough overlap that they, instead of building a stereo paired, static image, they were able to build a point cloud. So they made this like LiDAR. It's pretty cool stuff. So I have some examples here. This is a 3D image from an AEG workshop that we ran back in November. So this is near Lake Berryessa. This is Cache Creek running through the area. You can see the little blue tiles for where the drone snapped the photograph. And then we've got the three-dimensional model down underneath. And everybody's standing under tents because it was raining pretty bad that day.
What program do you use to create 3D models?
This one was made with Agisoft.
That's what we use.
Yeah. So this is great. I think in future earthquakes, we're going to have geologists with drones flying the length of a fault or getting up high on a hillside, mapping landslides. All this stuff has been going on with the recent Italian earthquakes. They've got drones flying all over the place. The hurdle that they always hit in emergency response is, the FAA doesn't want to give them airspace. They've had so much trouble with people flying drones when they're trying to put out a fire that, I think there'll be hurdles there in the future. So we took this same technique and we tried to do similar modeling on some 1927 stereo paired air photos in Beverly Hills. So we were able to build ortho photos, point cloud, DEM, and then a hill shade of that DEM with a 1 meter resolution. So the result is this. It's still noisy, and we have to do some work on figuring out how to get rid of some of that noise. But we know that the Santa Susana Fault runs right through here somewhere. So if we're going to spend our time cleaning this imagery up, we just need to do it along a swath. And there's certain things that confuse the image. If you have low contrast areas, say a grassy field, the software can't pick one pixel from another, so it doesn't know how to put a surface in there. So you get these little spiky areas and funny things popping up. Most of these are streets and not artifacts. But to me, this is like historic LiDAR. I really have a lot of hope that we can turn this into something good. Seismic Hazards Zoning Program. We consider liquefaction, earthquake-induced landslides, and more recently tsunamis. Tsunamis are kind of mentioned tangentially in there. In the Seismic Hazard Mapping Act, it just says, when the state geologist thinks that the science is good enough, go for it. So we're at the point now where we're going for it, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Start with liquefaction. Little fire and water problem here. We collect a lot of geotechnical data, not only the stuff that cities and counties are required, but we go out to cities and counties and we collect geotechnical reports. We have a lot of students and a lot of our geologists spending time key entering borehole data into a database, and then we take that borehole data and we run it through an analysis program that assesses for liquefaction to every layer in that borehole. So we're not applying a factor of safety. If 1 inch of that sandy material in that borehole says yes for liquefaction, we're going to flag that as a liquefiable borehole. We're improving our techniques. I'll talk about that in a bit. Any time where we know liquefaction has occurred before, any artificial fill area where we're not sure the fill has been put in right, we're going to throw those in the zones. Again, the purpose of the zone is to trigger the site-specific investigation, not to answer the question. And then we have some other geologic criteria that I'll talk about in a different way. Anyway, this is an example of how we do our borehole analysis. This is the Oxnard Plain. The blue dots represent the boreholes that were collected and used in the analysis. Our folks did a lot of cross sections. When this diagram was done, we were going from paper and pencil cross sections into this new thing called GIS, but really they were just using it as a CAD, but it still worked, and they were able to get useful stuff out of that. These days we have better tools. This is something that Ellie built for me, Ellie Spangler. Let me take this off. It's just an easier way to visualize the subsurface.
How deep are your holes?
Most of them are terribly I don't know how to get that on there.
You may need to escape out of the presentation.
Yeah. There you go. It's short.
I think it's on the other side.
Ah.
There.
Sorry about that. Anyway, you get the idea. You can do cross sections in this software. You can identify where the groundwater is, actually map it, contour it. It's just a better way of looking at your boreholes.
What software is it?
That one's called ArcHydro. It's an ArcGIS plugin. The boreholes that we're getting are anywhere from 5 to 80 feet deep. Most of them tend to be on the short side. We're finding that people are doing at least one 50-footer if they're trying to comply with the requirement for the site-specific study to look for liquefaction. So if they were all 50 feet or more, I'd be happy, but you know, there'd be more work to do. Okay, input layers that go into the analysis. So we're doing analysis at each borehole. We're looking at new techniques that I'll talk about on how do you turn that into a map, right? If you have a bunch of boreholes and you have a quaternary geologic map, you know, you have to use some geologic judgment to say, well, here's my deepest water in that unit. I'm going to hand draw this contour. So we're trying to come up with more analytical ways to do it. But the main things that go in there, we use historic high groundwater, and the historic high was proposed for use, and we were told by the Mining and Geology Board that you need to use historic high because places like Simi Valley, Fountain Valley in Orange County, San Fernando Valley, once these areas grew houses instead of tomatoes and strawberries, all of a sudden the groundwater that was pumped for agriculture started coming back up. And so that's our conservative approach for delineating the zone. Again, that's just to get that site-specific study triggered, and then they can assess whether that's the appropriate groundwater to use for their development. We have a term called liquefaction basement. That can be either your 50-foot groundwater, 40 or 50 feet, depending where you are, or top of Pleistocene. So we're mapping those, and this is just an example of that. If your groundwater intersects your top of Pleistocene in this area, that's where we draw the zone boundary. So we're trying to put some geologic thought into that. The other critical one is having good superficial quaternary geology, and that's important for one of the what's new things there. We also use the ground shaking opportunity map. So in a PSHA study, like a statewide study, we have our peak ground acceleration for a certain risk level. We use a 10% in 50-year or 475 return period, annual return period for an earthquake, that level of risk for our shaking. What the liquefaction opportunity is, in developing that PSHA, you want to set the earthquake magnitude at magnitude 7.5, where all the empirical relationships set the magnitude. So this is one way to adjust the PGA level used in the liquefaction analysis for a predetermined magnitude. So it's kind of a special ground shaking map.
And do you use the same PGA for over the whole map pretty much, or do you vary?
Well, for each 1 kilometer pixel area, we use the same level of shaking. So that 475-year earthquake shaking risk level will have a PGA of 0.2 in 1 kilometer pixel, and the next one might be 0.25, 0.23. So it's more the risk level that we're targeting rather than a certain ground shaking level for a whole area. And this is just some of the calculations that go on in each borehole. N represents the blow counts. You know, they drop a hammer on the pipe, drive the sampler in the ground, and that represents the density of the soil. That density represents the resistance of that soil to liquefaction. So CRR stands for cyclic resistance ratio. CSR is a cyclic stress ratio. That's a driving force. That's an earthquake shaking that you would expect it to hit. So that's the PGA that you're applying at that borehole. So your factor of safety is just your resisting forces over your driving forces. And then if the factor of safety is less than 1, it gets flagged as liquefaction. So the new things for liquefaction. We have been using what's called the standard penetration test everywhere we go, because that's kind of been the industry standard for liquefaction analysis. There's a new tool that's been out for quite a while, but is now becoming more available, and we have talked to a number of cone penetration test providers, and they're willing to give us all this data. So we're incorporating that into our analysis. So instead of every 5-foot intervals you get a blow count for your liquefaction analysis, this is a continuous measurement of that resistance to liquefaction. It's a much better tool, much better relations have come out of that. We are trying really hard to move towards a deformation-based hazard analysis. Right now, as I mentioned, our geologists go in there, they look at the groundwater level, they look at the geologic formation, they look at the borehole analysis, and they're kind of hand drawing that boundary to the liquefaction zone. So the idea is if we can figure out what the deformation will be, much like what the landslides do, and we'll talk about that, we can have a threshold for an anticipated deformation as the trigger for drawing that zone. I thought I had a picture of that. I guess I took it out. And then the last one was the loss estimates. Back in 2010, 2011, Christchurch, New Zealand got hit with a series of 4 to 5 very large earthquakes. Each one triggered more and more liquefaction. They have gotten to the point where, based on a deformation number measured in the field, they can estimate what the economic loss will be to single-family residences. So that sidesteps the whole part. They've done the homework on, you know, if you get 1 centimeter displacement, you get this much damage to a house. So now we can say from 1 centimeter displacement, we've got, you know, so many thousands of dollars of economic loss. So it cuts a lot of the work out of the process. So we're hoping to incorporate some of that. Okay, I want to talk about earthquake-induced landslides. This one is deformation-based. We're using what we call a Newmark analysis. It's a very simple model. Try to picture a cinder block on a board that's tilted, and then you shake the board. You know, how much does it move? It's quantitative, and we have to collect certain types of information to do that. But we calculate these numbers. They're centimeters, but it's really an index. I mean, we're not saying that, you know, that's going to be 15 centimeters displaced. It's more of an index property that we use it. And any time that there's a landslide that we've identified with our air photo interpretation, that landslide gets thrown in the zone as well. We're not trying to analyze every landslide for that. So for the landslide side, we're also collecting a lot of geotechnical information. In this case, we're collecting shear test information that characterizes that rock strength. And then we group it based on similarities between different formations. So we have what we call strength groups, And then we take that information and we use the stratigraphy, the geologic map, to give it a spatial component so we know where those strengths should be applied. We use geologic structure. We have methodologies where we use the topography and the structural geology to look for areas where you have adverse bedding conditions, because we know from past earthquakes that dip slopes produce more landslides than anti-dip slopes, or at least more significant landslides. So there's an example of the adverse bedding map for a 7.5 minute quadrangle in Southern California. And then we, again, throw in the landslide inventory, and the final result is our geologic material strength map. So this is one of the main inputs into the landslide zoning. Again, our simple model, I'm sure it could be drawn to be more complex, but I like the simple look. But this is the parameter we're after. This is what we're calling our susceptibility. It's called the yield acceleration. So it's the inertial force of that earthquake that just causes that block to slide, right? So every time that inertial force is exceeded, that block will slide until the inertial force goes the other way. Then the block will slow down and stop. So every time that inertial force goes in that direction, beyond that level, that block's going to slide a certain amount. And then you just accumulate all that displacement, and that's what gives us our index property for making our zone maps. Input seismic data, we use the PSHA map for the state to assess that. And that goes into our regression equation. This is from Randy Gibson's USGS publication, 2007. But we just program into ArcGIS or GeoMedia or whatever GIS platform this little algorithm. So we've got your PGA here, got our yield acceleration here, and your magnitude here, and everything else is already plugged in. So this gives us a pixel by pixel displacement value, and then we aggregate that to make our zone map. So what's new here? What we have found in collecting a lot of shear strength information is that there's never enough. So we've been looking for field-based observation methods of assessing rock strength. And this Hoke-Brown criteria, something that comes out of the rock mechanics community, is one that we have found to be pretty good through a few different studies. We're actually using it in Contra Costa County now because there are absolutely no shear strengths. So anyway, there's been a few publications on this methodology, and we feel pretty confident that we can train our geologists, maybe when they're making that geologic map that's underfunded, to collect some of these parameters while they're at it. There are better techniques out there. So I said we're using this block on a board approach. It's called a rigid sliding block. For deeper landslides, that's not how they respond. When you get a deeper landslide, well, it's going to deform. It's going to create its own ground motion. It's going to behave differently. So there are methodologies now that will span that whole range of rigid block behavior to deformable block behavior as well. So we're looking into those as well. And again, probabilistic analysis, so we get a better understanding of what our uncertainties are. I'm kind of out of time here.
Well, how much more you got?
A little bit, but I'll go through them quicker. This is our statewide map of priorities. I just want to point out the green areas are where we have mapped, and we have a lot more to do. So we're working on that diligently. Want to point out some new things for getting at the data that we are producing. Our information warehouse has been revamped. It looks the same. I don't know if anybody's been there, but the data underneath is much better. There's GeoPDFs for areas where there are combined zones. There are links to all the GIS data. It's all projected the same. Metadata is cleaned up. So that was a big push. Just came out last week. We are working on a web feature service. It's going to look like this. This is just a mock-up of it using ArcGIS Online. Liquefaction in green, landslide in blue, Alquist Priolo, fault zone in yellow, and then we just purchased a statewide parcel map to try to make this feature service work so that you can go in and tag a polygon, which is a parcel, and determine what hazards might affect this property. And then you be able to type in an address and get that same answer. And this is geared towards answering the questions that we get from people with the real estate disclosure. I want to talk quickly about the tsunami. We have been working for about 15 years with Cal OES on tsunami hazards in California. It really took off in 2009 when we put out these inundation maps. These are not appropriate for land use planning. It's not quite ready for a seismic hazard zone. But what these are good for is telling people where they need to go if a tsunami is coming. Most of the tsunamis that California is going to experience are from far sources. So you have 5 to 15 hours before it's going to get you. That's a lot of time. You can evacuate a lot of people. Most of this work has been funded by FEMA and NOAA. We are trying to get state funding for it now. But a couple things are driving us now. 2 years ago, we had this working group publish a paper, and one of their big recommendations was, let's get these zones built. Let's build them with probabilistic techniques. Do better warnings. Got to support the feds, and focus a lot of attention on the maritime and harbor communities because they are the ones most vulnerable to this. So just quickly, we are in the midst of reviewing the report for the probabilistic tsunami inundation maps. Just like the PSHA, you've got seismic sources. These are the sources that are triggering tsunamis. You've got the path that it travels across the oceans. This is the Tahuco earthquake model. I don't quite know why this little strand came over to impinge on us, but it's kind of interesting. And then the inundation. So the red and blue lines represent different variations of our evacuation maps that are out on the website. And they just say, get off the beach. Whereas the different colors represent different inundation depths for the 2,500-year recurrence tsunami. So anyway, we have a lot of work to do. We need to work on policies. We need to figure out what level of risk to apply. So we're pulling together expert groups to help us with the technical side of this, other expert groups to help us with the policy and implementation. Hospital and school review. Every school in California that is elementary to community college gets geologic and seismic review for projects that are on their campuses. And this came out of the 1933 Long Beach earthquake, where all the schools were wiped out. Fortunately, it happened in the evening, and I think there was only one gymnasium that had a basketball game going on, and I don't think anybody got killed in that. So 1933, earthquake happens, legislature jumps into action, we have the FIELD Act. 1971, San Fernando earthquake happens, the VA hospital, Veterans Hospital has major damage, people die, Hospital Seismic Safety Act goes into effect. So instead of a local building department inspecting hospitals and schools, the legislation calls for the state to take that work on. So the Division of the State Architect looks at all school projects, and OSHPOG, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Statewide. Yeah. Anyway, it's a big, long acronym. They are the building department for all hospital projects in the state. So that's what came out of those earthquakes. Again, just some information. Picture on the left here, all the red dots represent schools in the LA Unified School District that are in liquefaction zone. So this is important to them that this review work happen.